Always a great start. Okay. All right. We'll get started as people kind of filter in here. Okay. Thank you for joining us today. My name's Samantha Hooker, and I'll be the moderator for today's Eval Café. The Café is a longstanding speaker series hosted by the Evaluation Center at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, Michigan. The goal of the series is to encourage a deeper dive into all things evaluation. We'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and honor the ancestral land of the Three Fires Confederacy, recognizing that WMU is located on lands historically occupied by the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Batawadni nations. We're excited to be joined today by Rebecca Teasdale, assistant professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Rebecca is an evaluation methodologist who examines the valuing process and evaluation. Her research is grounded in her previous work in STEM research, evaluation, and education. To ask Rebecca a question, you can enter it into the Q&A area at any time during the presentation. We'll have time for questions at the end. You can also tag me in any questions in the chat, or feel free to send a message directly to me. And with that, I'll hand it over to Rebecca.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I'm excited to be in conversation and share space with all of you. I'm going to try to share my screen now and make sure that the tech is working for us. So how does that look? Okay, great. Great. So I am, as Samantha said, I am an assistant professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And I'm actually joining you today from my home in Chicago. And so I want to start by recognizing that both my university and my home also sit on the original homelands of the Three Fire peoples, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi, as well as the homelands of the Menominee, the Miami, and the Ho-Chunk nations. And as some of you may know, today, the Chicagoland area is home to actually one of the largest urban Native American communities in the United States. So I want to start by acknowledging and honoring the original peoples of the Chicagoland area and the many indigenous people of this land, past, present, and future. Today, I'm going to be focusing on three main topics before we move into a broader conversation. So I'd like to start by thinking about what criteria are, how evaluative criteria function at multiple levels in evaluation practice, and why they matter. That was all one topic. I'd like to briefly introduce a model of criteria, domains, and sources. And then I'd like to share some examples of how that model can help us as evaluators with criteria specification in practice. And then, as I said, we'll have time for conversation and feedback as well at the end. So to frame this conversation, I'm approaching this and thinking about evaluation as fundamentally a process of examining the quality of a program, a policy, an initiative, and really thinking about the why, the reason that we're examining quality. It is typically, in my experience, to inform real-world decision-making and fundamentally to contribute to addressing some sort of social issue or improving social conditions, ultimately to promote healthier communities and more equitable and just communities. And so that process of examining quality and the entire evaluative process is structured around the ideas that we have, the values we hold in terms of what the problem is, the social issue, how we define that, and what a high quality or a good program is in seeking to create change around that. So the entire process is structured around these implicit or explicit definitions of what a good or high quality program or initiative is, and those are evaluative criteria. Criteria represent people's values. So these are our beliefs about what's important in a particular intervention, what success looks like, what matters most in terms of program characteristics or program results. And that's what enables us to recognize a high quality program and to identify ways to improve a program that's less than ideal. So in evaluation practice, criteria operate on multiple levels. In evaluation theory, we often associate criteria with the general logic of evaluation that was conceptualized and articulated by the late Michael Scriven. And so probably a lot of you are familiar. This is a process of establishing criteria of merit, setting standards associating with those criteria, and then comparing the performance of the program to those standards. A lot of you probably also are aware that there's an ongoing conversation in the field about the extent to which evaluators actually employ these steps in practice and the extent to which they're actually familiar with the idea and the use of criteria. And Ozeki and colleagues from Western Michigan have done some great research to help to clarify some of this. For today's purposes, I want to draw on their clarification of some of the terminology that evaluators use. So they tell us that synonyms sometimes used by evaluators to describe criteria include indicators, measures, or variables. So this idea of criteria as these program-specific quality indicators represent one important level at which criteria operate, right? Criteria also operate on a broader level. So in 1997, Stake and colleagues responded to Scriven's conceptualization of the evaluation process and of criteria, and in fact, they objected to that conceptualization. So they had conducted some interviews with evaluators, and they found that the evaluators they spoke to spoke of criteria, but not so much as succinct and critical particulars as Scriven prescribed, but more as broad classes into which data can be placed and easily referred to. Seldom are the criteria seen as direct criteria of merit, but rather as information categories from which interpretations of merit are made. And so this is pointing to a second level at which criteria can operate. At this level, we can think about criteria as these broad categories or classes of quality. When I talk about and when I write about criteria, I'm often joining a conversation that is focused on those program-specific indicators. I actually find it more helpful to step back and to think about these broad categories of quality. Now, they are framed, and I've just framed them in opposition or in tension with one another. I actually find it helpful to consider how they relate to each other. But for the purposes of this talk, I want to focus on the broad categories of quality, and I'll tell you why. Focusing on the broad categories or classes of quality can really be helpful in distilling the central ideas, the key meanings that constituents hold about what matters most when it comes to programs that they are involved with or affected by. We know that community members and program participants and staff and leaders, all these different constituents can hold varying values. And so focusing on these categories of quality can help us to surface and examine those values. It can also help us to surface and make explicit varying levels of power in terms of constituents' influence over which and whose values are going to be prioritized. And this really matters because the values that we prioritize, the visions of a successful program that we prioritize, are going to fundamentally shape and guide the evaluation. And so engaging and negotiating values about program quality is really fundamental to enacting an evaluation that's going to be credible to key constituents, that's going to be useful, and that's going to be ethical. This aligns with a more expansive notion of valuing and aligns with some work that Tiffany Tovey and Tom Archibald have done thinking about reflective practice. So focusing on these broad categories of quality helps us to shape the valuing process as a reflective dialogue with constituents and helps us to guard against evaluation being reduced to a merely technical process of auditing. So Tovey and Archibald talk about the evaluator's job as engaging in a reflective experience with stakeholders around how that program or policy upholds its stated values, is valuable, and reflects other salient value propositions. So I want to step back here and share a little bit about how I came to this work and how I've seen these sort of theoretical ideas play out in real life, in real practice. So my first exposure to evaluation was working in organizations that were working against intimate partner violence. And I wasn't an evaluator, I was a program person, and I didn't have the language, this language to describe it at that time. But what I saw was how varying values about program quality really mattered in terms of how services were implemented and designed, certainly, and also how they were evaluated. So I was working in a shelter space, and we were running around collecting all sorts of data that our funders cared about, and a lot of that focused on engaging law enforcement. So our funders cared a lot about restraining orders that were issued and orders of protection that were put in place. But staff and leaders in the organization and the folks that were seeking services really recognized how engagement with law enforcement could place victim survivors at greater harm. So specifically, Black women being at risk of police violence, folks who were undocumented faced harm when law enforcement was involved in their lives. Some LGBTQ plus folks could be forced to come out in engaging with law enforcement. And so we saw how these varying values, varying conceptualizations of program quality made a real difference in terms of how we might evaluate, whether we were going to be focusing on law enforcement contexts, whether we were going to be focusing on self-determination and agency for victim survivors. Similarly, there was broad agreement of the importance of providing services that were culturally and linguistically appropriate. There was also tension and disagreement about the extent to which services should rest at that individual and interpersonal level, or should also be addressing systems of oppression and root causes that underpinned intimate partner violence and made folks vulnerable to that violence. And so we were wrestling with these issues of varying values, and different constituents in the context had varying levels of power and influence over which of these values and whose values were prioritized. The reason this is quite central to the evaluation process is that when we choose a particular criteria category to prioritize, it sets the course for the evaluation, right? So different criteria are going to shape different lines of inquiry. They're going to inform a different aim for the evaluation. They're going to point to different questions to be asked, different data to be gathered, and ultimately different conclusions that we're going to draw about program quality. I've drawn this diagram as this like very linear sort of neat process. What it might actually look like, however, is how it can change along the way. So those initial criteria in this view of how criteria operate need not be fixed. So as we learn more about the program and the context, as constituents reflect on and dialogue about their values, and as the context itself changes, those definitions of quality can change. And that can lead us to reshape inquiry along the way. So I want to be clear that this broader view of criteria as categories of quality have room for this type of flexibility and responsiveness. So we're starting to see how criteria operate at multiple levels, how central they are to the evaluation process. And I think also perhaps beginning to see how messy they are and how complex they are to work with. And so this is why it's particularly important for evaluators to be really intentional and explicit about the criteria around which a study is organized. But we know from the literature that in practice, criteria are often not updated directly. And it makes it really hard to know what definitions of quality are being prioritized. It makes it hard to examine and debate and critique those criteria. It makes it hard for constituents to see how we've reached our conclusions and whose values those conclusions were based on. And so coming into academia, into an evaluation methodology program as a doctoral student, this is where I took my experiences as a program person and started to move toward figuring out how criteria operate and how they can be of use. And this is because I was taught that I should articulate criteria explicitly. I had seen the importance in my professional life, but I had no idea how to do it, in part because I couldn't find any frameworks or models to guide me. And so for the past 5 years or so, I've been developing an empirically supported model of evaluative criteria. And this model addresses two aspects and the relationship between them. So in the gray circle on the left, we have the domains. These are these categories of quality that we've been talking about. They represent the focus or the substance of a criterion. On the left, in the green, are the sources. So these are the people or documents from which criteria are drawn. And considering these two aspects together helps us understand these varying values that constituents hold. This is an active area of research for my research group. It is an empirically supported model, so we are continually investigating this empirically. The current version of the model includes 11 domains, and you'll see them on the screen. I'll just kind of highlight a few. We know number 4 probably stands out to a lot of us. Outcomes and impact is a common area that we define a high quality program as one that achieves the outcomes, the intended outcomes. Number 2 really speaks to the quality of program design and implementation. Sometimes that's fidelity of implementation. Sometimes that's the skillful adaptation of a program. I'll highlight a couple others that we are currently studying right now. Number 3 focuses on participants' experience with the program, whether participants are treated with dignity and respect, if they have a positive affective response to the program. This overlaps with some conceptualizations of satisfaction, acceptability, is kind of all in this bucket. We're also looking at number 6, which is relevance, sort of how we might define program quality in terms of the match between the program and those that it aims to benefit in terms of their needs, their circumstances, and their priorities. And then the last domain on the list, equity and social justice, is an area I'm working currently with Dr. Cherie Avent. We are doing a lot of work around understanding how the domain of equity and justice, empirically, we're seeing it functioning in evaluators' practice as a lens that cuts across other domains. So we're seeing evaluators who are investigating equity of experiences, whether outcomes are equitable and just use of resources, looking at sustainability as an issue of justice. So these are, so check back later. The domains will be continuing to be developed, and we'll be sharing that as well. And then this is the list of sources. These are, again, the program or documents from which criteria can be drawn. So many evaluators start on the left in the green box, the program related. They might be looking at program objectives, talking to staff and leaders, maybe moving into the middle in the gray box, speaking with the evaluation commissioner or looking at a funding proposal, or at the bottom of the gray box, drawing on a particular evaluation approach. This model identifies additional sources to be considered, such as the intended beneficiaries, community partners, the general public or the community at large. And so the idea here is to sort of map the territory in terms of domains and sources that are available to evaluators. I'll be happy during the Q&A to answer any questions you have about the model, how it was developed, what research we have going on, but I thought it might be most helpful now to share 4 examples of how this can actually be used in practice. because that's what drew me to this, was trying to figure out how to navigate this. And I think others might wonder that as well. So, four examples, the first one being that the model can be used to help identify relevant values and criteria. So to help evaluators really figure out which program characteristics or results matter most to different constituents. This is a matrix that Emily Gates has introduced as a strategy for identifying the criteria that matter most to different constituents. So you can see the sources listed in the column on the left, the domains across the top, and actually determining what matters to whom. The idea here is sort of using this strategy to be really intentional and explicit as we identify stakeholder values, and then being able to find those areas of overlap and agreement among different stakeholder groups, as well as locating areas of divergence or disagreement. We can also use the model then to explore additional definitions of quality, additional criteria that didn't show up in our matrix. So basically that's using the list of domains and sources as that map of the territory to show us what else is out there that may be relevant for our evaluation. So you can take this completed matrix and then reflect on other definitions of quality that are important and whose voices and values are missing so far. Again, the aim here is to be more intentional and also more inclusive as we select criteria. And this gets at the varying levels of power and influence that different constituents bring to the process. So if we only are starting with the program objectives, the commissioner's values, those are the folks who have the most influence over shaping the scope of the evaluation. This provides a mechanism for stepping back and creating space to elevate and center additional voices and values, particularly of those most affected. So this strategy for specifying criteria is discussed in a recent chapter in New Directions for Evaluations that Emily Gates, Robin Thomas Pitts, and Clara Shim and I have published. And so I invite you to take a look at that. The QR code on the slide will take you directly to a set of downloadable handouts, a case example, and other free resources that accompany the chapter. If you're interested, you can find the matrices, and there's also a self-study guide for folks that are interested in kind of learning about this and working through it on your own, as well as resources for anyone who is doing evaluator education more formally in a classroom setting or in a workplace setting. So then, once we've selected these criteria, this model can also really help us guide our evaluation design. So, as I mentioned earlier, evaluative criteria often remain unstated, but they're always there. They're always directing our line of inquiry, shaping our line of inquiry based on which visions of a high quality program are in the forefront. And so we can make that explicit by actually specifying the categories of quality, the domains that we plan to investigate, and then organizing our questions to address those domains. And then from there, we can build out the rest of our evaluation plan. And this can be really helpful because it can ensure that we have a really strong link between those definitions of quality that we are prioritizing, the questions we're asking, and then our plan to answer those questions. The fourth area where this can be helpful to practitioners and to improving our work is really thinking about criteria in structuring our reporting. So I said I've been working on this model for about 5 years. I can tell you that I have analyzed many evaluation reports and articles. And I've seen firsthand the claim in the literature that criteria often remain implicit and unstated. And so Bianca Montrose-Moorhead and other scholars have really emphasized the need for greater clarity and completeness in evaluation reporting, and I concur with that. My research group is currently working on some recommendations around criteria reporting based on our analysis, including exemplars that we can offer the field. And I'll share a couple with you now. So one way to do this is by labeling each evaluation question in our reporting with the associated definition of quality or criteria domain. So this is an example from Aisha Boyce and colleagues. And then reporting the data and findings by question. And so this can really help the reader follow along and understand the link between how quality is defined, what questions are asked, and the answer to that question. Another approach is using a summary table. This is one from Sapru and colleagues that specifies, again, that domain, specifying indicators or those more program specific criteria, as well as metrics and data sources. This can bring even greater clarity because it communicates exactly how each definition of success or quality was investigated. And so that is another exemplar that we found in our inquiry. So those 4 ideas are just intended as a starting point to kind of think about how we can apply this notion of criteria as broad categories of quality to evaluators' practice, how we can draw on this in our work. I'm really curious at this point to open up to discuss your experiences working with criteria and the values they represent, your thoughts about this approach to criteria, and any questions that have come up for you. I would love to hear as well.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I see Aaron, they're already all set, but you can go ahead and raise your hand next to the reactions button. We have a larger group, but if you raise your hand, we can go ahead and have you unmute and ask your question, or you can put it in the Q&A section. So Aaron, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. Really great stuff. I'm curious how you see this operating in more kind of rapid evaluation activities where perhaps you want more agile, responsive evaluation when you're doing perhaps more developmental formative evaluation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that so 2 things come to mind. So first is that, kind of going back to Tovey and Archibald, I would say that it's the conversation that matters, and it's the establishing of those definitions of quality and those broad categories, and sort of having that reflective conversation and understanding different constituents' value perspectives is, I think, a very fundamental role that the evaluator can bring into that program development phase, into that developmental role. And I think that, something that in this current study that I've been doing with Dr. Avent, where we're speaking with evaluators who have been investigating issues related to racial equity and racial justice. And I think it re-emphasized for me that there's work that we do as evaluators that is the formal evaluative process, right? And there's work that we do in our observations, in our conversations with constituents, in the rapid feedback that we provide. And all of that is shaped by the definitions of quality that we hold, or the values that are being privileged. What do we focus on? What do we pay attention to? What warrants that rapid feedback? What do we just, call a meeting about when we see something happening? All of those, I think, are informed by these priorities we set around our visions around what we're going for in this program that we're participating in, and how we're defining what a good outcome will be. And I shouldn't use the word outcome. What a good picture of change will be.
Thank you, Rebecca.
I'm curious if others have different opinions, if how all of you might approach that, because that's a great question.
Right, and there is a question in the chat as well. When you have a moment, could you post the link to the resources that you shared the QR code for?
Absolutely.
Okay. And is there anybody in the room? Would you like to unmute? Do you have any questions in person?
This is Lori Wingate here in the Eval Cafe room at Western Michigan University, and appreciated that list of I can't remember if you called it the sources or domains, but the list of 11 areas.
Mhm.
And I realized you didn't have time to go into all those. But I was curious if you could expand on the first one. I think it was the first one, which was alignment. Can you explain that one?
Absolutely. And I, after folks have had a chance to grab the QR code, I'll go back to the list too. Yeah,
I
alignment.
was just gonna pause like that. For me, that QR code, I was the one who asked for that because it opened a survey and not resources.
Yes, so that is that is Robin Thomas Pitts at her. That's the entry point into where these resources are housed. So she's asking folks to provide their contact information so that we are able to understand who's using these and where they're going. Yeah.
Okay, my misunderstanding. Okay, go ahead. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me go back to. Oh, there they were. Okay. So alignment is a domain that speaks to the sort of how this particular intervention program initiative complements or fits in with other initiatives in the larger context. So I do a lot of work, for example, in public libraries and informal learning contexts. And so an example from that space would be the extent to which a particular initiative that's being implemented in the library fits with the strategic directions that the municipality is prioritizing, or the state has identified as a really pressing need for create change around a particular social issues. So is this particular initiative that I'm evaluating working at cross purposes with other initiatives? Is it duplicative? Is it contributing and creating a more robust and comprehensive approach? Or is it draining resources away? So it's sort of placing it in a broader context across a particular geographic area, across a particular context, across a particular disciplinary or focal area. Does that make sense?
Yes, that was really helpful. Thank you. And while we have the mic open here, does anybody else in the room have a question?
I'll ask a question. Hi, Rebecca. This is Val.
Oh, hey, Val.
Yeah, nice to see you. I just wanted to ask a quick question about the weighting or level of importance across domains. Like, do you have any suggestions for that? Do you do that by audience or?
I don't know. That is something that I'm really interested in as well. And I'm interested in that at multiple levels. So, for example, I have evaluated programs that achieved their intended outcomes, and folks had and reported a really terrible experience in the program, in the way that folks were treated, in the in sort of the lived experience, the quality of the program experience, or whether a program achieved an intended outcome that was a complete mismatch with what communities needed. So it achieved, it would be judged as success in terms of outcomes. It would be judged less successful in terms of relevance or in terms of experience, or in terms of resource use, that we achieved a desired outcome at great expense, right? That was out of proportion with the outcomes achieved. And so it raises all these questions around how do we put these together. That's something that I'm really interested in, and I think that the way that I want to study that is in real time with evaluators, right? I think that's the way that I can think of, to study this, is to really understand that that process and that negotiation and balancing. So it's something that I think about a lot. Another question that people ask a lot that is on my mind is, like, how many lines of inquiry is appropriate to pursue? How many definitions of quality can we hold in our arms at the same time? And so that's something that, again, I think needs to come directly from evaluators and from the experience on the ground of working with these, and sort of what are the contextual factors that contribute to or constrain looking across multiple domains, and how do we balance those? So these are all open areas of inquiry that I think are really interesting and really complex in the actual unfolding of practice.
Okay, and I just want to draw attention to a comment in the chat section. Peggy just wanted to say that Jane Davidson's Nuts and Bolts book is an excellent guide on criteria, especially with regard on how to structure reporting. So if that's something that anybody on the call hasn't checked out, it has a thumbs up from Peggy. And then,
I love that book. I highly recommend. So thank you for highlighting that.
okay, and we do have a question in the Q&A section. Curious about the framing as program quality criteria, which seems to hearken more to process or implementation. Success or merit worth criteria seems broader. Since the list of domains is general, I'm just curious on the framing.
So I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's this balance between outcomes and process. Is that right? Kind of results of a program and the process of program implementation.
That would be my guess. If it was an anonymous participant, so if
Okay.
you'd like to message me or offer any clarity in the chat, I'll let you know if I get anything.
So that's also something that I think about a lot. And the original version of the model actually had the domains were divided into two groups, one that focused primarily on implementation and one that focused primarily on results. And originally it was framed that way. I framed it that way. And then that broke down quickly, because as soon as I started looking, whatever I put in the results category, quickly often results are considered in relationship with process, right? So if we think about like resource use, it is often a question of cost effectiveness that is a relationship between implementation and outcomes. So it got messy fast, and then it just got really messy when we start thinking about, for example, thinking about adding applying an equity and social justice lens across. It also gets messy in terms of how evaluators often speak about the things they investigate. The word outcomes often gets used as a so when we've been analyzing and sort of looking for all these evaluation reports, we often find people talking about their outcomes in terms of program reach, or their outcomes in terms of sustainability over time, or their outcomes, right? And so some of this is sort of thinking about how the evaluation is framed initially in terms of what the line of inquiry is, what the definition of quality is. If it's about when I think about outcomes and impact, it's about changes in an individual's life circumstance, in a community's level of well-being, in health status, in knowledge, in but definitely that's not universal. There are some evaluators who use the term outcomes more broadly.
Okay, thank you. And another question in the chat. How is critical lens used to talk about colonialism and privilege, aka the reason why we need social justice as a criteria? Stepping out into these areas and your positionality and the pathways to privilege are essential to evaluation.
Is the question asking about how that is done generally, or asking about my own positionality in this work?
Nicole, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's about how you're applying critical lens to talk about colonialism and privilege.
Yeah. So kind of going back to when I was where this all started for me, which was in the context of the intimate partner violence work. And when I began to see sort of how systems of oppression were directly implicated obviously in the social issue that we were seeking to address, in intimate partner violence, and also were bound up in the in the way that social programs were defined, implemented, and evaluated. And for me, that showed up, I was young, I was right out of college, a young white woman coming into that space. And as a young queer white woman coming into that space and seeing how the way that power was exercised, it directly influenced whose voices and values were centered and the assumptions that were made about what quality, what success, and what was a desired outcome. And so it really has given me great pause to think about who, I think about Alkin and Vo's work around who gets to do this, like who's doing the valuing. And when I think about participatory approaches to evaluating or participatory approaches to valuing, it's around centering that community agency to actually define for themselves what quality looks like and what success or what desired outcome we're headed for. And so in this most recent work with Dr. Avent, we've been looking at equity and social justice as this lens, and really trying to unpack, in addition to the ways that we show up as evaluators and we enact this process of inquiry and enact our relationship with communities and with our role as an inquirer, how do we actually examine the program itself and the contributions it's making, or the ways that it's reinforcing processes of colonialism, processes of oppression, in the very work that it's doing. And so that's a really active area that we are unpacking, and really interested in conversation with others who think about these issues as well.
Thank you. And Lori, it looks like the hand is raised for in-person. Do you have an additional question there?
Go ahead.
Hi, Rebecca. My name is Lissa Beccio. I'm here in the Evaluation Center. Thank you so much for your presentation and generally your larger body of research around this area. I've always found it just really fascinating. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the evolution of, what I'm going to call valuing, and how we think about this process of setting criteria and making evaluative judgments within our field. I think you've really referenced all the big thinkers in this area, but it seems like for something that really is core to the practice of evaluation, that, we haven't had a whole lot of innovation or advancement beyond, that conversation between Scriven and Stake and all.
Yeah. I'm really excited that Emily Gates is going to be at the Evaluation Cafe. I think it's just in a few weeks, right? Talking about whether, our criteria really central or not. I think that some of the work that is being done in systems evaluation really raises some important questions. A lot of the work that I've been doing, it's grounded very much in discrete interventions and discrete programs. And I am really interested in understanding whether and how it might be applied to systems level change, as well as other sort of emerging areas of evaluation. It gets back to actually the first question around emergent, or what I would interpret as emergent criteria and rapid response cycles. So I think it's really interesting to think about how valuing happens in the context of more flexible, more fluid, and larger scope change initiatives. And I think that that's an area that I'm really interested in continuing to follow. I think there's also a lot of continued, I think there's a continued need to really understand the role of power in this, and to really, a lot of evaluators that I speak with in practice are like, well, we get this, the commissioner set the study up this way, and I'm here to implement it and evaluate the criteria as given. And so that also kind of harkens back to that colonialist role that evaluation has played in reinforcing those existing structures of dominance and power relationships. And so how do we think about this for evaluators in those situations? How do we negotiate those preset lines of inquiry? That's something that's also, we're learning about in that study with evaluators who focus work on issues of racial equity and racial justice. Is how do you push back? When do you push back? With what costs? And how does your positionality and our positionality as evaluators influence that as well? Or how are we placed in a particular risk in doing that? So yeah, those are a few of the things that I'm thinking about in the evolution of this area.
Thank you, Rebecca. And you did mention Emily Gates, which prompted me to go ahead while we're talking in the chat. I put a link to register for any of our upcoming fall cafes, and then a link where you can also join our mailing list to stay in the loop. So those are in there if you're interested. And we have a couple more questions, so I'll just keep them coming. Okay, there is a question about identifying the metrics to measure the results in a domain. So once you've agreed on criteria and phrased your question, do you feel that you find agreement there easily? So in your example, you had a percentage of participants, but how do you know which percentage is poor, good, excellent? Do different stakeholders have different expectations here? And how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, those are great questions. And that goes back, let me see if my slides will cooperate. That goes back to this relationship, right? Is sort of connecting this broad level categories of quality down with these specific indicators. This is where I really turn to the work of Jane Davidson. I think the work that she and others have done around rubrics, evaluative rubrics, is really helpful in operationalizing these more program-specific indicators. No, I do not find broad agreement. The example from the exemplar from, I think that was the SAPRU exemplar, that was actually, I would love to ask that question, of some of evaluators, is sort of how they get to those agreed, or are they agreed upon metrics, and how do we get there? I think I'm very interested in that translation and how we move from those broad categories of quality into these specific indicators, and particularly how evaluators negotiate and navigate those differing points of view and different values in that space as they move from one to the other.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question in person.
Yes, please. My name is John. I'm in the room. Thank you for your presentation. I just want to find out from your criteria domain, some of the terms within the domain, do they overlap with the OECD DAG evaluation criteria? Because I saw some relevancy, impact, and other areas that I think they overlap. So that's what I'm asking.
Yeah, great question. So the domains were developed by synthesizing a number of different criteria models, including the original OECD DAC and the more recent revision. And so there is it's not a one-to-one mapping, but they do inform that. So the original model it came in an AJE paper from 2021, I believe, sort of has a matrix that I used in mapping those out and in sort of finding the overlaps in the different domains that were present in the OECD DAC, in federal criteria models from the United States and Canada, and in the evaluation literature more broadly.
Okay, and Rebecca, another question in the chat. Is sustainability featured anywhere in the criteria? It's part of all CES eval criteria, credentialing, work, etc.
Yeah, so sustainability is an active area that we are working on in my research group as well. We're starting with that the current definition in the model is includes both sustainability of programs, sustainability of, of the benefits, and environmental and it's a mess. There's a lot in there, and so part of it is to start to differentiate this and pull this out. I was actually at CES this summer and was really interested in, found the conversation there really helpful around how folks are thinking about around the climate crisis and sustainability and ways of thinking about it. I found a lot there to inform our thinking about that criteria domain. If anyone is interested in a conversation about that, I would really welcome that, because that's something that we're really puzzling through right now, and are hoping to investigate going forward.
Okay, thank you. And we do have time for a couple more questions. If feel free to raise a hand or put it in the chat or the Q&A section. The last question that we currently have is whether you can share some examples of programs that have used this type of model in their evaluation.
So yes, we currently have a paper under review that provides 3 case examples of using this. Emily Gates is first author on that paper, where we took this criteria model and this approach, and she and her team used it in evaluating several different programs. So hopefully that will be coming soon, and we'll have more to share about that. I'm also, as I mentioned, I do work in the public library space, and so I'm starting to work with some public library programs to use this kind of evaluation strategy to map out domains and areas of focus. I'm working right now with public library makerspaces. So makerspaces are creative spaces where folks use often high-tech tools like 3D printers, laser cutter engravers, CNC machines, and public libraries are increasingly offering these kind of workshops. And so we are building out an evaluation framework to use these domains to guide looking at outcomes of participation, the relevance of those outcomes to folks, the access and reach of spaces, experience in the spaces, and then trying to understand how we might apply an equity and justice lens across those criteria. So this is, it's active work in progress, so stay tuned.
Okay, thank you. It looks like that wrapped up our questions for today. There are a couple of comments thanking you in the chat, and a request to connect, so you can check that out. But I want to thank you for your wonderful presentation, and thank you to everybody that joined us and all of your participation today. I just want to remind you to register for our next Eval Cafe. That'll be on Wednesday, October 18th, featuring Mindy Lynn Anderson. She's the founder and principal of Mirror Group, and her presentation will be on culturally responsive and racially equitable evaluation. You can find the link to register for any of the fall Eval Cafes in the chat box, as well as the mailing list link. And I just want to thank you all again, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
See,
Thank you, Rebecca.